And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection, I'm your host, Robert Pictou. Our show today comes to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Sipshan people. Checking into a hotel is generally a straightforward process. Simply book your room online or by calling a hotel, arrive at check-in time, and visit the front desk with your ID. We begin today's Open Connection with Angela Sterritt as she shares checking in the hotel at this year's Nation of Nations Women's Gathering.
Something funny happened on the way to me on the way to this forum. Just everything that could have possibly gone wrong. Like, I'll let you use your imagination for this because it was like one of those journeys. And so I arrived here at the hotel, which was sort of the final frontier of everything that could have gone wrong. And so I arrive at the front desk and, this should be like a fairly straightforward thing. I'm here to check in. And so I arrive and they're like, hi. And I'm like, hi, like I'm here to check in. And they're like, oh. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, what's your name? And I'm like, it's Angela Sterritt. And they're like, oh. And so they're looking on their screen and they're looking at me and they're looking at their screen and very sus. And I'm like, okay. And they're like, can we have your ID, please? And I'm like, yeah, of course. Here's my ID. And they're like, Angela Sterritt, hey? And I'm like, yeah. And so she's like, it's like becomes this big thing. And she calls in like another worker to, I guess, look at the screen and figure out what's going on. I had no idea what was going on at this time. And she says, well, Angela Sterritt has already checked into your room. And I'm like, okay. And I'm like, I don't know any other Angela Sterritts. I know this one in Texas and she's absolutely bananas. And I realized the moment I said that was the wrong thing to say because they were like, right. And I'm like, what is going on here? Like someone's pretending to be me? Like we hear about pretendians, but like this one's a pretangela? Like, is someone a pretangela? They're pretending to be me? Like, who the hell is this person in my room? And I'm like, maybe can you just go up to the room and like bring Angela Sterritt down so I can talk to her? And so they're like, oh, yeah, sure. We'll go up in the room and we'll talk to Angela Sterritt. And they even show me a paper that Angela Sterritt signed and everything. So I'm like, I'm having like a bit of like an identity crisis, an existential crisis. Like I felt invisible in my life, but I'm just like, am I even here right now? And so she comes down and they're like, oh my God, we made this big mistake. Like, no, you're Angela Sterritt. Like there's no Angela Sterritt in the room. And so I'm like, okay. So I go up to the room and I open the windows and I just held my heart and I was just like, I am here. I am Angela Sterritt, and I am here, and I'm here in this beautiful, incredible Tsimshian territory, and I'm so blessed. It's so nice to be so close to home right now and see the mountains and the ocean and be surrounded by the love and the language and the heart of the people. It feels so good to be here. I'm so blessed. And something that's so important to me is to be surrounded by our own people, our language, our worldview, our kindness, and our beauty.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. According to the Vancouver School Board website, it is protocol to acknowledge the traditional land you are on at a meeting or event. In BC, recognition of that land is often unceded because BC is the only one in Canada in which 95% of its land is unceded or non-surrendered Indigenous territory. Let us rejoin the conversation as Angela shares more of her nation's protocol.
Simgiget, Sigidem Hana, Ganthkabal Wilksit, Luam Godi, Wingeasum, Atum, I'm just learning my language, so don't judge me, because now I know people know here, when I'm in front of a bunch of white people, I know they have no idea what I'm talking about. So I can just say whatever the heck I want, but now I'm like, these people know that I don't know. But anyways, Angela Sterritt, Lilgiazumbis, Waya, Walter Sterritt, Yaal, Wilpswigak, Lakibu, Gixan, Luck, yep. So I just shared there that I'm so happy to be in front of you all today, and I really genuinely, truly am. Listening to that last panel, like how empowering that was for me, and to see, I know Shanine's gone now, but she's Giksan, and we also spent some time in Winnipeg together. She's known as Shanine the Scene online. I absolutely love her. And I shared a little bit about who I am and where I come from. So on my mother's side, I'm white. My mother was from Belle Island, Newfoundland. She had Irish and English roots. And then on my dad's side, I'm Giksan. And so you'll know that I'm just learning my language. I'm learning that through one of my elders, my cousin, Dr. Jane Smith. And I was learning my language, and I was doing it through Zoom from Vancouver. And as I was looking through the Zoom, I could see everyone in the class was introducing themselves by way of their house and their clan. And as most of you probably know, if your mom's non-Giksan, then you need to be formally brought into your community by way of adoption or through an auntie or a high-ranking member of your house group. And that hadn't happened yet. And so I said, how do I introduce myself? And she said, well, we'll give you an honorary Giksan name, and you can introduce yourself to your grandfather's house. So my grandfather, Walter Sterritt, was groomed his entire young life to be the hereditary chief, the Weeman of the House of Wigak, the House of the Big Wings. It's a huge role. It takes a lot of money in a modern day context, takes a lot of resources, a lot of time away from family. And so he actually said no to that role, even though he was groomed to be that his entire life. And so my uncle, Neil Sterritt, who passed away a couple of years ago at the young age of 106, took on the role until he passed away. And so Jane said, well, you'll introduce yourself through your grandfather's house group, but we'll also give you an honorary Giksan name. So coincidentally, at the same time, I decided I was going to quit my job, and you'll hear more about why, at CBC as a longtime radio, television, and digital reporter. Something, I thought was an important role. It did a lot of amazing things for our people. But I was quitting. I'd had enough. And so I phoned up my boss and I said, I'm quitting my job. And she started to cry and she said, please don't go. We'll do anything to keep you. And I said, no, it's a very spiritual decision. I've made this decision, but I'll meet you for coffee and we can sort of wrap things up. So on my way to quit my job as a longtime television and radio reporter, I get this email from Dr. Jane Smith, and she says, your honorary Giksan name will be Lualgia Dumkbis, and it means woman who works in television and radio. And I'm like, okay, this is awkward. But then the literal translation of it is talks in a box. So I'm like, wow, I thought I was so important, and it's just been whittled down to talks in a box. So I'm like, all right, this is a humbling moment in my life. It's actually kind of cool because my great-grandmother's name is Luox, which means inside the copper. And I had a spiritual person tell me, well, that's interesting because you can't turn on a radio or a television without copper. So there's that beautiful connection there. And so my boss ended up luring me back into CBC, ended up staying until September of that year. I think I tried to quit in May. And then I became Lualgia Dumkbis by way of Feastal system in June 21st of last year. So it was a very proud moment for me. So what I just shared with you there was a story of belonging, something that we all long for, and that is of connection and of sovereignty.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. Storytelling is the core of culture. It is how histories are passed down, how customs are shared, and how traditions become endemic to a group. Shared culture is rooted in shared tradition of communicating. Let us rejoin the conversation as Angela shares about the power of story.
So today I want to talk to you about the power of story, the power of narrative, the power of belief, the power of speaking up, and the power, the supernatural power of change. Because we desperately need change in this world right now, don't we? We're living in some very violent, polarizing, horrific times. We absolutely need stories, in particular about Indigenous women and girls, to shift. And we definitely need to speak up. No more silence. In Canada, we've become comfortable, we've become content with silence. And I think it comes from wanting to protect ourselves from feelings that arise when we admit things that we're not so proud of. We may shy away from the things that we're not so proud of, but as those like Gabriel Maté say, in order to heal it, we have to face it. But we can be proud. We can't change the past, but we can pave a new way forward. And be proud. Be empowered to be proud, to build a home, a country, a business, and a community that we love. And we can do that by our own collective beliefs and our own collective machinations. My dad, who you'll hear more about in a very different context in just a bit, he used to be a logger. He used to work a lot on the land. He was a bush guy. And so we spent a lot of time outside. And when we'd look at the beautiful, dark, black night sky and we'd see the first star that would come out, he would say, you always make the same wish over and over again. Even when you're blowing out your birthday candles, you make the same wish over and over again. Because it sounds like it doesn't benefit you, but it benefits everybody. And when we wish for this for everybody, it comes back to ourselves, obviously, because we're everybody as well. And it sounded at the time really stupid. And now it's very cliche. As a journalist, I would call it cliche. But he said, you wish for world peace. And so now every time I pray, every time I make a wish on that first star, every time I blow out the candles, I wish for world peace. And that peace, that safety is something Indigenous women and girls have not been afforded. Oh, this is to give the nod. And a trigger warning, please take care of yourself. And I always tell people, even if you're bored, if you leave, I will not be insulted. I often teach to teenagers and some of them put their heads down and sleep. And I'm like, that's cool. Everyone needs sleep. But if you do feel triggered, if you do feel like some of the content is really heavy, please take care of yourself and leave if you need to. I won't be insulted. I want to talk a little bit about safety that Indigenous women and girls aren't afforded. We're not afforded the same care and compassion as other people and other individuals in this country. And the stats don't lie. We know that even though making only 4% of the population, Indigenous women and girls made up 25% of the homicide rate in this country. We are 12 times as likely to go murdered or go missing than any other race of females in Canada, and 16 times as likely as white women. We are 7 times as likely to be murdered by a serial killer. And so what do these stats mean? What do they tell us? I was recently interviewed, last year, 2023, I was interviewed by the CBC about my book, and they asked me about a report that CBC put out in January of 2023, and it was looking at the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls to action. There were 231 of them. Out of those 231 calls to justice, how many do you think were completed? The final report came out in 2019. How many do you think were completed by January of last year? Are you all journalists? The jaded group? I love it. I love people who are jaded. 0, lots of zeros. So it was 2. 2 were completed out of 231. And so the host said, well, what do these statistics tell you? What do these details tell you? And I said, well, it sends a strong message out to the world, doesn't it? That Indigenous women and girls don't matter, which is the exact opposite of how we are seen in our own communities. We are the ones that carry the knowledge of the salmon, of the rivers, the migration of the elk. We're the ones that carry the stories that are delineated, our trajectories, our lineages and totem poles. We're the ones that carry the children. We're the ones that carry the strength. And so how do we get to a place where we do matter just as much as we do in our own communities in Canadian society? How do we get to that place? Well, for one, on my white side, I have a big responsibility to dismantle systems that have kept us down for hundreds of years and to deconstruct those systems, to reimagine them. But then on the other side, on a deep cellular level, we can extract solutions from stories.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
As a Gitxsan teenager navigating life on the streets, Angela Sterritt wrote in her journal to help her survive and find her place in the world. Now an acclaimed journalist, she writes for major news outlets to push for justice and light a path for Indigenous women, girls, and survivors. In this final segment of Open Connection, Angela shares about Ramona Wilson.
So the first one is that, and you might be very familiar with Ramona Wilson. She's featured prominently in my book. And the reason why I featured her is because, for one, I have everybody that I talked about in my book, I have consent from. That's incredibly important in my work, to have consent and to be working collaboratively with family members. And so Ramona Wilson was a lot like me. She was from Gitnamax, but living away from home. She was living in Smithers. She was also like me in that she was a writer. She was a poet. Also like me, she had a belief in a higher power. I believe in the strength of my ancestors. She believed in a God. She was the responsible one in her friend group. She had a job at Smitty's restaurant. She was going to become a summer counselor that summer. And she had a really tight relationship with her mom and her sister and her nieces and nephews. Her sister, Brenda Wilson, told me that she loved ham and pineapple pizza. She loved to curl up on the couch beside her mom and eat lasagna. And she was an incredible young woman. She was 16 years old in 1994. And she was on her way to attend a graduation ceremony, something all young people should have the right to do. And unfortunately, there was no safe transportation system on the highway. And I always ask people this, and you all probably know better than most audiences that I speak to, when do you think a transportation system came along the Highway of Tears after all of those years? So family members were fighting for this transportation system since 2006, since the Highway of Tears symposium that I also spoke at. There was a lot of calls for justice, calls for action in that report. That transportation system didn't come into play. It started being worked on in 2018 and was completed with networks in 2019. Cell service, another thing that family members were fighting for, didn't come into the area until 2022. A lot of people say, and yeah, there's a lot of spotty areas, right? I was just on it yesterday. And Gladys Raddick told me, well, maybe that's interesting that's when the pipeline started to be built, was in that year. And so I don't have to tell you about the reserve system, about the poverty, the racialization of poverty, the deep settler colonialism that exists in our society. But one of the things that really stuck out for me in this case is that the families were not believed. Her family was told, maybe she ran away, maybe she just needed to get away, maybe she's out partying. Well, that wasn't Ramona, and they knew it. She would have told her family, she would have told her friends. She was not believed. There was no missing persons report, there was no posters put up. That was all something that the family members had to do on their own. And this is not a standout case. The other really horrific part of this is that 3 other young women had gone missing in the same year and very close to proximity of time to Ramona. So it wasn't like this was an isolated case. But the police blamed the family. They blamed the victim, something we see over and over again. The media was critical of the police and also the community. So Ramona Wilson's family really wanted the community of Smithers to support them, to hold a fundraiser. And they said, no, we're not going to do that, but we're going to hold a fundraiser for a white woman who went missing in Vancouver, Melanie Carpenter. Her killer was found a day later. Ramona Wilson's case is still unsolved.
We said prayers for her.
And so what would have happened if her family would have been believed? There could have been action. There could have been search parties. There could have been search and rescue teams.
Believes in spirits.
Maybe she wouldn't have been found, but maybe the case could have been solved if we would have been only believed. One of the things that stood out about Ramona Wilson, her sister, Brenda Wilson, I was speaking in Prince George at a book event, and her sister said, I keep on hearing you say, you could have been her, you could have met Ramona Wilson, my sister's fate. But I keep on hearing you say, Ramona Wilson could have been you. She could have been a great writer, an author, a journalist, a motivational speaker, and she wasn't given that opportunity. And so in thinking about Ramona Wilson, thinking about the care, the lack of compassion of young Indigenous women, I'm also drawn to another case, another story, another young woman, Tina Fontaine. I don't know if people have heard of Tina Fontaine, but she was Anishinaabe, and my son is related to her. My son is also from Saugeen, where she was from. She was 14 years old, and as you can see, she looks really young. She was really small, and she was having a really, really challenging time. Her father had just committed suicide. She was living in Winnipeg. She wasn't with her family in Saugeen. She was living far away from home. She was in the child welfare system. They couldn't find a placement for her, so she was up in a hotel by herself. She was seen in school. She was seen by victim services. She was seen by the child welfare system. But yet, nobody did anything when they could see she was struggling. Unfortunately, in 2015, her body was found at the bottom of the Red River in a body bag. And the reason why I think it's really important to talk about Tina Fontaine is because it was one of those stories that resonated with Canadians so much. There were protests snaking around cities. There were posters of her everywhere. People were holding up placards with her name, Tina Fontaine, justice for Tina Fontaine. There were murals all over cities. I saw her on the news. People were painting portraits of her. And I thought, where were those beautiful tributes to her when she was alive? Where were the people who saw her when she was on the street? I have friends who pass by people who are unhoused and living on the street, and they say, get a job. And I say, that's the hardest job you will ever do in your entire life, sitting on the pavement for 12 hours a day, begging for change, having men telling you to do other things for money. She was struggling, and people could have seen her. What could have happened if people saw her?
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind and heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.